Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. We are continuing Who Ate the First Oyster by Cody Cassidy. This is Chapter 3, Who Ate the First Oyster. This and all subsequent events occurred after humans evolved. It is time, if the time of our species on Earth were a day, this happened at 10:53 in the morning, or 164,000 years ago, near the tip of Africa. In the summer of 2007, a team of archaeologists, led by Curtis Moreau O'Marion of Arizona State University, working in a set of caves on the southern cape of South Africa, found evidence of a found evidence of a 164,000-year-old Homo sapiens encampment. They uncovered the charcoal remains of ancient campfires, stone tools, red pigment, and most critically, shucked oysters, the oldest evidence that someone had braved eating the slimy oyster. But according to Marion, the shells signify far more than an adventuresome palate. He believes these crustaceans were the edible reward for a difficult and obscure astronomical observation made by a scientist who lived more than 100,000 years ago. Who was this scientific hero and culinary daredevil who braved the first oyster? Her name was Oyster Gal, or at least that's what I'll call her. The name isn't as far-fetched as it sounds, and it may even be a rough translation of her actual name. Naming conventions throughout history are usually descriptive. For example, Johnson, Smith, Baker, rather than a set of random pleasing sounds. And if her name did have meaning, what else could anyone have called the first person to crack open a rock-like object found in a tide pool and eat the pale, snotty creature inside? Jonathan Swift once famously mused, "He was a bold man that first ate an oyster." And Swift was probably right that eating a pale lobe of shellfish meat was a courageous choice. But he was probably wrong about the other part. The evidence suggests it wasn't a bold man that tried the first oyster. It was a bold woman. In every hunter-gatherer tribe studied by modern anthropologists, there exists a gender divide for obtaining food, regardless of whether the bulk of the work falls to the hunter, you little shit, or the gatherer. The division is remarkably strict. Women usually gather the staples that are more reliably obtained, such as nuts, berries, roots, and shellfish, while men typically pursue the food that runs, flies, or swims away. Even in the tropical islands in the north of Africa, where gathered foods were plentiful, the men did little food gathering. And in Tierra del Fuego, at the southern tip of South Africa, where the majority of the calories came from hunting large sea animals, the women did not hunt. There is no anthropological consensus that explains the gender divide in hunters and gatherers. There are theories, however. Richard Wrangham traces it to the control of fire, and specifically the time required to cook. Chimpanzees eat food as quickly as they can, lest a larger chimp steal it. Assuming early hominins behaved similarly, cooking would have been an impossibility for all but the largest. As a result, Wrangham theorizes, in order to cook, females were forced into a kind of mafia-like protection racket with larger males who ensured a smaller female could cook in exchange for some of the food. With males now guaranteed a night's meal, they were free to pursue higher value foods without risking hunger in the likely case of their failure. It's only a theory, and one that's nearly impossible to prove, but it would explain the curious male and female food partnership in Homo sapiens that's unobserved in any other primate. It would also explain the strict sexual division of labor in hunter-gatherers, why staples like oysters are more likely harvested by women, and why a woman is more likely to have eaten the first. Oyster Gal was a Homo sapiens, which means if she were to sit on the bus next to you, you would not be immediately alarmed. Her stature, body, face, and hair would look familiar. She had the same size cranium, jaws, teeth, pelvis, feet, and hands as we do. She would be shorter than modern standards, but her posture and gait would be entirely modern. Her skin would be hairless and dark, evolved to better shield against the intensity of the African sun. The hair on her head would be dark, short, and curly. Her clothing, however, would be a little out of the ordinary. She probably didn't wear any, or at least nothing we would recognize as such. Sewing was unknown. The bone needle didn't appear for another 100,000 years, and researchers now believe the first use of both clothing and shoes occurred remarkably late in our evolution. According to the anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus, who has studied the toe bones of ancient Homo sapiens, Oyster Gal's toes were considerably stronger than yours or mine, probably because she walked without supportive shoes. Trinkhaus believes Homo sapiens' toe bones have atrophied in the confines of sturdy shoes, explaining the notable difference in the size of ancient toes. According to Trinkhaus, modern toes didn't appear until around the same time as the bone needle, suggesting Homo sapiens didn't invent their shoe until long after Oyster Gal. As an adult, Oyster Gal was likely the mother to children, though perhaps not many. In a study of the Kung San hunter-gatherers of Africa's Kalahari Desert by the anthropologist Richard Bourchier-Lee, he found that the San women went a minimum of 4 years between children. Because they didn't use any formal birth control, however, the explanation for these long periods of infertility is unclear. One hypothesis, proposed by Rose Frisch and Janet MacArthur, is that Kung women, while healthy, simply don't have sufficient body fat to simultaneously nurse and menstruate. Nursing, according to their theory, may have provided Oyster Gal a natural form of birth control. If she had a young child, she would have communicated with it and her peers, but to what degree is a matter of great debate among archaeologists. Richard Klein, a professor of anthropology at Stanford and the author of The Dawn of Human Culture, tells me he believes Homo sapiens of Oyster Gal's era probably lacked a modern language, citing their dearth of sophisticated culture or technology in their encampments. He dates the origin of modern language to a time long after Oyster Gal, approximately 45,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens encampments exhibit an explosion in cultural artifacts. Sites dated to this era exhibit unequivocal evidence of modern behavior, such as art, music, and a belief in the supernatural. Marion, on the other hand, believes that Oyster Gal dreamed, laughed, and communicated fluidly and thoroughly. The languages spoken at this time, he wrote to me, were as rich as our own. As evidence, Marianne cites the decorated shells and the natural painting pigment he has found in the Pinnacle Point caves in South Africa, both of which represent examples of the kind of symbolic thinking that archaeologists look for when determining an ancient culture's cognitive modernity. Marianne believes that many of the tools she made were so complicated that the techniques to make them would have been impossible to teach and pass on without language. Until recently, Marianne's view was in the minority, and most archaeologists agreed with Klein. Oyster Gal and her contemporaries, they believed, differed in some significant cognitive way from modern Homo sapiens. Now, With the discovery of the artifacts in the Pinnacle Point caves and other ancient examples of symbolism, scholars are far more split on how Oyster Gal viewed her world and what happened when she spoke. She could certainly have communicated, but to what degree remains a matter of scholarly debate. However, there's no question she and her people lacked the significant technological innovations of later Homo sapiens. There is no evidence, for example, that she used fishing poles, nets, or boats, which explains why Homo sapiens encampments from Oyster Gal's area are rarely found along the coast. For Oyster Gal, the ocean represented a food desert, and as a result of living on the beach, would have needlessly cut her foraging area in half. This explains, according to Marion, why in the eras prior to Oyster Gal there's little evidence of hominins ate food from the sea, and no signs of shucked shells. A key reason, according to Marion, is the tides. Oysters are only revealed by tide's lowest ebb, which means 95% of the time they would have been inaccessible. This infrequency and unpredictability probably explain why early hominins didn't gather them. According to Marion, hunter-gatherers never base a subsistence system on gathering methods they cannot schedule or do not understand. The Pinnacle Point caves contain thick deposits of oyster shells. Clearly, oysters had become a staple part of the diet, perhaps because Oyster Gal discovered a sign that foretold their appearance. When Oyster Girl ate her first oyster, she had likely ventured to the ocean in search of something else, a sleeping turtle or its eggs, or maybe a beached whale or resting sea lion. Archaeologists have discovered a type of barnacle among the artifacts in the caves called the Corunula diadema that lives only on the skin of humpback whales, a suspicious item in a cave 3 miles from the ocean. Eventually, on one of these trips, Oyster Gal would have by chance arrived at a super low tide and found a few exposed oysters, and then cracked one open and braved its meat. With all the respect to Jonathan Swift, this might not have been quite as courageous as it appears. A few other animals, including modern baboons, eat oysters, which, if observed by Oyster Gal, would have given her some confidence in their edibility. But baboons also eat blossoms and bark, and an experienced food gatherer like Oyster Gal would have been cautious about following the dietary example of other animals. It's an experiment that can sometimes end poorly. If she watched a rabbit eat a few berries from the Atropa belladonna plant, for example, and did the same, she would have died within the day. Still, if she saw another animal eat an oyster, it might have provided the necessary courage. Cooking her oyster would have provided more. Cooked food is safer than raw, and caution is something the slimy, wrinkly oyster would certainly inspire. Dietary boldness, however, was not Oyster Gal's real genius. Based upon how many oyster shells have been found in the Pinnacle Point caves, Marion believes that Oyster Gal knew when to travel to the ocean. In other words, she learned how to predict the ocean's tides. Super low tides on the southern tip of the African coast occur for a few hours during a few days every month, but they aren't just infrequent, they're inconsistent. The level and timing of both low and high tide change dramatically throughout the month, from a slight difference between a low and a high tide to a large one, and the explanation remained a mystery to hominins for millions of years. It's easy to see why. The solution to their pattern lies in an incredibly unlikely and seemingly unrelated location, the night sky. The ocean's tides are caused largely by the pull of the sun and moon's gravity. When they both align, either on the same side of the planet or opposing sides, they pull together at Earth's center and create a tide that is both super high and super low. Fortunately for Oyster Gal, this random seeming event is advertised by the appearance of either a full or a new moon, which means Oyster Gal wasn't just an adventurous diner, she was a stargazer. The link between the movement of the ocean and the various shapes of mysteriously large white object in the night sky is so incredibly non-obvious that many people today still don't see it. Oyster Gal, however, did, and in doing so, may have well become the world's first practical astronomer. Once she could predict the tides, Oyster Gal could confidently schedule trips to the ocean, and the evidence from the caves suggested oysters became a reliable staple of her diet. If her discovery of the moon's link to the tides was celebrated, Oyster Gal didn't have long to enjoy her renown. As a 20-something woman of ancient times, contemporary actuary tables suggest she was nearing the end of her lifespan. According to an analysis of tooth wear done by Rachel Kaspari, an anthropologist from Central Michigan University, 2/3 of Homo sapiens from this era who lived beyond childhood died in their 20s, and very few made it past 35. Although it's impossible to know exactly how she died, we can say with some confidence how she didn't. Nearly all of the leading causes of death today were prehistorically known, either because they are primarily the diseases of old age, cancer, heart disease, stroke, or require large, concentrated populations to support, cholera, typhoid, and flu. Neither of these circumstances existed during Oyster Gal's era. The far more likely causes were childbirth, malaria, accident, homicide, or bacterial infection. She may have been attacked by a predator while foraging, or perhaps her adventuresome palate caught up with her. Once she passed, she may have been buried by her people, but whether her burial was to honor her memory or simply to discourage scavengers is again the subject of contentious debate among scholars. Archaeologists have found bodies older than Oyster Gal buried, but the graves don't show any of the gifts or signs of care that would eventually become universal across all cultures. The first evidence of ritual burial comes from a grave in Israel, where archaeologists have found the skeleton of a man with the jawbone of a boar on his chest, dated 60,000 years after Oyster Gal. As a result, it's impossible to say whether Oyster Gal, a prehistoric scientific genius who helped solve one of the greatest problems of her time, had a memorial service. If she did, hopefully an oyster shell was placed on her chest, ideally one that was in the shape of a crescent moon. That's the end of Chapter 3. Please like and subscribe.